Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start for this last plenary session of the Risk Forum. And today we have the great pleasure to welcome Tarun RAMADORAI. So Tarun, thanks a lot for coming today. Tarun is Professor of Financial Economics at Imperial College London. He has an exceptional range of research interests from household finance, but also asset pricing, real estate, international finance, and also the Indian economy. So that's something we maybe know less. You have published on these topics in top economic and finance academic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics. You have received several awards for this research, including the Brattle Prize for Best Paper in the Journal of Finance, and you are currently serving as editor of the Review of Financial Studies. So what is even more exceptional, I would say, and that's good for this conference, is that you have served in a range of policy-making institutions, and because here we try to gather both academics and professionals, so that's something very important for us. So on top of your academic work, so you were the chairman of the Inter-Regulatory Committee on Household Finance, constituted by the Reserve Bank of India, economic advisor to ESMA and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and you currently serve as co-chair of the FinTech workstream of the India-UK Financial Partnerships. So today you're going to present one paper, we say two, but so because you have so many interesting papers for this audience and this conference, you have one on algorithm fairness in the credit market, you have one also on Robo-Advice, so both were very interesting for this audience. Finally, we decided you would only focus on the first one. So you're going to talk about the effects of machine learning on credit markets, and that will be related to the following panel discussion. So we pretty much look forward to it. So Tarun, thank you very much for being there, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to talk about a particular paper that we've done on machine learning in credit markets. But before I get into talking about the paper, what I want to do is to set the tone a little bit to try and give everyone an introduction to the way that economists have been thinking about issues of fairness and discrimination and how that relates to algorithms in particular. So fairness in decision-making is not a new problem. It's a really, really old problem. And here's a little quote from a paper by a computer scientist and an economist written together. And it basically says that a rich line of work within computer science examines the differential treatment by algorithms of disadvantaged and marginalized groups. Many leading notions of fairness are based on some variant of the question, are members of different groups who are of equal merit treated equally by the algorithm? Now, this could read just as easily, are members of different groups who are of equal merit treated equally by society, the market, judges, firms, and the government. It's not just very unique to algorithms. And also there's a point here that the notion of fairness is at the level of the group member, which is to say that once you know very granular details about the group member, the group identity should be far less relevant to the decision-making process. In other words, whether you're black or you're white or whether you're male or female should make no difference given the very granular details of your productivity or your output or any of the objective measures that we think of as being important. Now, at least two dimensions of the growth in algorithms are unique from a fairness perspective. In particular, an algorithmic decision-making process makes the criteria very transparent. I mean, there's an argument that people make that actually algorithms are not transparent, but quite the reverse is true. We need to specify our inputs. We need to manipulate these inputs to get outputs, and there's a process for doing that. We have to pick a very clearly specified objective function of the outputs to maximize. The more automated a process is, actually, the more explicit that the decision is, since there's less scope for discretion. And second, and we'll get back to this a little bit later, and this is in some sense why economists can be useful in this debate about algorithmic fairness, is that the inputs are usually treated as exogenous or fixed outside of the model, and we'll come back to that point a little bit later. So in a different way to say this, a debate about algorithmic fairness and discrimination is just really a debate about societal fairness and discrimination. It's just codified in a different way. Now, in economics, there's a rich history of work on models of discrimination. So perhaps one of the leading models is a model of taste-based discrimination. Much of the work in economics focused initially on labor markets, but these ideas have been ported to other subfields. So Gary Becker's 1957 book, The Economics of Discrimination, said that there was something that he coined as a taste for discrimination and how it would affect the labor market. So in particular, there's a set of racist or sexist or prejudiced employers who are willing to lose out on profitable opportunities to satisfy their bigotry and pay a price in order to satisfy that. And depending on the share of bigoted employers, you can show that this is going to create a wedge for employees. Now, it turns out that some people basically think that competition is just going to solve these issues, but it turns out that it doesn't have to go in the long run. Heckman had this nice statement about this, which is entrepreneurs can consume their income in any way they see fit, and only if the supply of entrepreneurship is perfectly elastic in the long run at a zero price, which we know isn't true, or if there are enough non-prejudiced employers to hire all particular types of workers, then maybe discrimination will disappear from Becker's model. So in that particular model, fairness or equality is presupposed. All workers are assumed to be identically productive, and then they're supposed to be paid their marginal productivity. But then there's a taste on the employer side that basically pushes their wages into a different place. So the Becker model assumes that workers know who discriminates and who does not. But even when you don't know and workers have to search for work, wage pay gaps are going to emerge even with lots of non-discriminatory firms in the economy. And effectively, the victims of discrimination in that case have a worse outside option. Their bargaining position is worse, and that makes it harder for them to renegotiate or negotiate with their non-prejudiced employers. Now, what is a little bit closer to the topic of our paper is models of statistical discrimination in economics. And so there are classic papers by both Ken Arrow and Ed Phelps on this. And these are versions of learning models with particular group attributes. So if you think about an employer that wants to know an underlying productivity parameter Q, but only observes a noisy signal Y of that parameter with some noise in it U, assume it's normally distributed, then they're going to infer productivity essentially by filtering, and it's going to be a weighted average of the true mean, which we think of as alpha, and the signal. And in particular, the weight that you attach to the noisy signal that you get depends on how noisy the signal is. You're essentially running a signal extraction problem. This is standard stuff from economics. And so the noisiness essentially tells you about how much you weight the signal versus weighting the truth. Now, what is discrimination here? It's a little bit difficult to define this because what you might think of is, suppose two workers have equal productivity, and if they have unequal wages, then that seems problematic at face value. We should probably think about doing something different. And in this model with equal average productivity, assume that there are two different groups, the group with higher noisiness is going to be shrunk more towards the average, but in fact, the overall average wage is going to be the same across groups. And so you can see that in this little diagram here, which is if there's a signal on the y-axis and, there's the true productivity on the y-axis and the signal is along the x-axis, and for black workers and white workers that slope is different because of the different noisiness of the signal. So the signal extraction problem looks different. You can see that what's going to happen is while the average wage is going to work out exactly the same for two groups, there's going to be a point alpha below which you'll get that white workers are paid unfairly, and above that point black workers are paid unfairly, but on average everybody seems to be paid exactly the same across groups. So there's no across-group discrimination per se, but within groups you'll see some differentials. Now this intuition becomes more complicated as soon as firms are risk-averse, because the noise will actually also lead firms away from the noisy group. And so there's lots of models like this that are interesting to study. Now, the other thing I just want to point out before I move to our paper is features that we take as fixed are the core features for how we interpret discrimination or fairness. But it turns out that if you want to think critically about these features, like productivity or income or things like that, there are important features outside of the model that drive them. So if there was historical slavery, you might imagine that that has effects on the current income distribution. And in some sense, we can't really just take that as given at the point at which we've decided that the algorithm has just allocated people with different income, different levels of credit. And so in some sense, we have to look beyond that. And ignoring these features can have unintended consequences, and I'll get back to that once we finish talking about our paper. So let me turn to that now. We use the setting of credit markets to think through these issues in the context of algorithms. This is joint work with Andreas Fuster, who's now moved from the Swiss National Bank to EPFL, Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham, who's at Yale, and Ansgar Walter, my colleague at Imperial. So the starting point of this paper is that default prediction in credit markets is now increasingly adopting these kinds of algorithms, and the paper is essentially asking the question, what's going to happen when you introduce this new technology into distributional effects in the economy? Is it going to change the set of people who are getting credit, and how is it going to change the set of people who are getting credit once you introduce this technology for credit screening? So I'm going to tell you very quickly, I'll tell you about the theory, which is what are some distributional implications of better statistical technology, with just a couple of graphs. And then, because the theory turns out to not give you closed-form solutions when machine learning models come in, which are highly nonlinear, we're going to take this to the data using large US administrative data on about 10 million mortgages. And then we're going to try to document and sort of peer into the future and ask the question, how might this new technology affect the distribution of credit in the economy? It's going to turn out that it will actually widen disparities, according to our model. However, there's also an offsetting extensive margin effect, which is everyone gets more credit. So, to set the tone, imagine a very simple prediction problem that a lender has, where the lender is observing borrowers with characteristics X and a default outcome Y. So, imagine that there's a single characteristic X. It just simplifies the intuition. You can always make it more complicated with multiple characteristics per individual. And the way that we're going to think about machine learning is that it allows you to fit more nonlinear functions. So the only thing that machine learning is doing in our setup is it's not increasing the span of X, which you might imagine it does with digital footprints and more data available, but we're simply thinking about the nonlinearity in this setting. And what we're trying to do is to contrast what happens when you move from a very simple linear technology to one that's nonlinear as an illustration. And it turns out that that example gives you a lot of intuition. So let's think about it in this case, where there's a single characteristic X. You can think about it as income, if you like. And on the y-axis is the default probability that you're trying to fit. And imagine that there's some cloud of points that's sitting in that space. And under the old restricted technology, you're only really able to fit linear functions. So that's the p hat lin. So you can fit a line, imagine, through that imaginary cloud, and it's just downward sloping. Because as income increases, creditworthiness increases, and so the default probability reduces. Now, into this world, imagine that we drop a new technology, and that new technology is that you can now fit quadratic functions. In this case, imagine that the quadratic function that we fit is the solid line that's over there. And as you can see, what's going to happen is that all of the people who are in the neighborhood of A, which is the mean of the distribution in this case, are going to have lower credit scores predicted by higher creditworthiness predicted by the model, because the default probability is estimated lower in the center. But if you're at the tails, you're going to get a higher default probability predicted. Okay? So that's because the solid line lies above the dotted line at the ends and below the dotted line in the center. Now imagine that there's two groups in this economy that have different distributions of characteristics. There's a red group and there's a blue group. And the red group, as you can see, is sitting much more close to the mean. Okay? It's a larger group, let's assume, so the mean is computed much more across that distribution. And the blue group is much more noisy. So this is kind of like the Phelps idea, where there's much more noise in the distribution of this characteristic. And you can see that what's going to happen is that the new technology is essentially mainly going to benefit the red group. And the blue group, because they have more mass in the tails, are going to get higher predicted credit scores in this case. Now, this is not, it seems innocuous, because all that the machine is doing in this particular case is that it's fitting better the cloud of points, and it just so happens that the blue group gets penalized relative to the red group. And that's one case which we call flexibility in our setup, where maybe the sheer flexibility of the model that you're allowed to fit is just giving people different credit scores. But there's another less innocuous possibility, which is that actually, and I'll just show you the picture, that the true default probabilities for the blue group and the red group are given by the two straight lines, the blue line for the blue group and the red line for the red group. And in this case, there's a higher average default probability for the blue group. If you're able to only fit linear functions, it's going to give you something that's sort of in the middle of those two lines over there, because that's all it can do. But if you have a nonlinear function that you can fit, it turns out that what happens is that the nonlinear algorithm is going to bend you closer to the truth at the ends, because it has an additional ability to do this. And essentially what it's doing here, it's kind of de-anonymizing the data. So even if you don't have the ability to use the group identities, which you're prohibited from doing, the machine essentially de-anonymizes you and says, look, you know, I just see that there's a cloud of points up here and one down here. I'm simply going to bend my credit provision in this direction. And so what's going to happen is essentially the blue group is going to lose out in this case, because the machine has essentially triangulated people. Okay, so this is not uncommon. This is something that computer science people look at all the time. So there are these two possible cases. One, the flexibility case, and the other one, the triangulation case, where the machine is essentially giving different people different levels of credit, or assessing their credit worthiness differently. And so we can sort of prove a few theorems in simple cases in which there's a set of continuous functions and the distributions are well behaved. But it turns out in general, there's multivariate distributions of characteristics X. Those distributions may not necessarily be well behaved. And it's also the case that the functions that you need to fit in machine learning are highly nonlinear and not necessarily differentiable in this simple way. So we now need to go to the data to figure out what exactly might be going on in this more general case. And so this is what we do. We go to data from the US Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they have access to two data sets which we merge for our analysis. The first one is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which has application date, income, loan type, size, and purpose, but also has information on the race, ethnicity, and gender of the borrower. And to that we merge a data set from Black Knight Financial called the McDash data. And this has loan performance data. It also has a set of characteristics of the borrowers, the FICO score, the LTV, the interest rate, and also has a default status indicator. These together give us, the merge is done inside the Fed, give us about close to 10 million mortgage loans that we observed from 2009 to 2013. These are both portfolio and government-sponsored enterprise loans. They're less than $1 million in size, and our default indicator here is that someone is 90+ days delinquent within 3 years of origination. So that's how we define a non-performing asset. Now in this data set, we actually, since we observe the ethnicity, we can see what the default rates look like. So you can see that Asian borrowers default the least, followed by white non-Hispanic borrowers, followed by Native American and white Hispanic borrowers, and finally black borrowers, who have the highest default rates. And this also, of course, reflects credit scores. So you can see that the FICO score, which is the Fair-Isaac score, essentially, which has now been adapted for modern purposes, is highest for Asians. These things range essentially between 0, not that you see 0, and 800. So you can see very high scores for the Asians, high scores for white non-Hispanic, and then sort of descending in the same way as the default rates. But what's also interesting, given the sort of build-up that we had earlier here, is that the standard deviation of these FICO scores also increases a lot. So the noisiness of the signal is highest for the black borrowers, followed by white Hispanic, Native American, down to white non-Hispanic and Asian, where the distribution is extremely tight. So you're sort of starting to see patterns that are not inconsistent with the simple framework that we've built up. So now we need to go run the models and see what happens. So when you do that, by the way, the other thing that we do observe is that we observe interest rates across different races. So this is the spread at origination over the average. And you can see that Asians are assigned lower interest rates. White non-Hispanic is exactly bang on the mean because they're the largest group in the data. And then again, you can see that the interest rates kind of follow the default patterns that we saw earlier. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this data, which has a bunch of features and then these default indicators, and then we're just going to estimate probabilities of default ourselves using a couple of different technologies. The first one is what is a stand-in for the linear technology, which is we're essentially going to run a logit. Okay, so a logit has decision boundaries that are linear in the space of characteristics, so it works out pretty well. But we also, so as not to create a straw man, also create a nonlinear version of the logit where we have lots of bin dummies or fixed effects essentially that we put in for different granular bins of the credit score, the LTV of the loan and income. The machine learning algorithms that we use are in the family of tree models, and in particular we use ensemble models like the random forest as well as the XGBoost model, which basically take lots of different trees. And essentially these kinds of machine learning models estimate step functions in the data. In a two-variable space x1, x2, it essentially divides up the region using a process of recursive binary splitting to consider where the default lies, and in multidimensional space it's essentially an equivalent of that. And that's a tree model schematic from a nice paper by Kandani, Kim, and Lowe. So we use these explanatory variables in what we do. We've got applicant income, LTV ratio, and FICO, which in the nonlinear logit specification we convert into little bins. And then the common covariates we use are the rate. We take these out also in some of what we do. The origination amount, documentation type, which state you were in, which year you were originated, and so on and so forth. Okay? So when we do this, the first thing we do is we estimate this. We do a training test split. We have 70% of the data as our training data, and then we evaluate the model on the test set of the remaining 30% of the data. And the out-of-sample performance of the model essentially shows you that the R-squared out-of-sample rises by about 15%. So the machine learning model is producing gains in terms of predictive accuracy. It's just better at fitting the default rates. The precision score rises by about 5.1%, which is you're better able to pick how many, the number of predicted defaults that are true defaults rises by about 5%. And we do some bootstrapping, and it confirms that there are very significant differences here. So overall, the machine learning model is a better predictor of the probability of default given the characteristics X. Now, this is sort of what we find with the probabilities of default, and so I'm going to spend a little time on this just to try to explain what's going on. So these are cumulative distribution functions of the probabilities of default in the data, and they're actually cumulative distribution functions not of the probabilities, but of the differences in probabilities across the two models. So this is the log difference, or the percentage difference, between the credit worthiness you're assigned, or the probability of default you're assigned, under the machine learning random forest model and under the nonlinear logit, or the old model. So obviously, if you win, then your log probability of default is going to go down under the new technology. And if you lose, your probability of default is going to go up under the new technology. So what you really want is you want more mass to the left of the line at 0. And we're drawing this cumulative distribution function for different ethnic groups. For the Asians, for the white non-Hispanic, the white Hispanic, and the black borrowers in the data. And so what you can see, if you just look at the line for the white non-Hispanic, which is the green line, is a little over 60% of the white non-Hispanic borrowers have lower predicted probabilities of default under the new technology than they do under the old technology. And about 38% have higher probabilities of default under the new than under the old technology. But what's interesting is that if you look at this across different ethnic groups, the share of winners relative to losers is very, very different. In particular, you can see that it's about a half of blacks do better under the new technology and a half do better under the old technology, relative to the 60% or 62% winners and 38% winners on the whites. Put differently, the gains are unevenly distributed of the new technology. Okay, so there are more winners than losers in the white group, and there are roughly an equal number of winners and losers in the black and white Hispanic groups here. Now, that's an interesting finding in and of itself, but this has not quite gone all the way to rates and so on and so forth, so we do a little bit more work to try to convert these probabilities of default into rates. We have to take a leap into estimating the counterfactual, because obviously these are coming off of loans that were already issued, so we do some work in the paper to try to get around that fact. But we have a very simple two-period model in the data, which just says the NPV on a loan is the present discounted value discounted back at the cost of capital rho of the green state when you get repaid with 1 minus p of characteristics x and whatever the rate is times 1 plus r, so you get repaid the rate of interest on the loan. But with probability p, which is the default probability, you don't get paid back and you essentially have to have some recovery rate of L tilde on the loan. And of course, you want to subtract off the initial issuance of the loan in the first place, which is L. Now, we assume Bertrand competition here, so we can solve for the rates in this equilibrium, and that essentially just sets the NPV equal to 0. And so this allows us to essentially figure out what the rates are that are consistent with the probabilities of default under these assumptions that we make about the credit market. And essentially, you could get some borrowers who have an NPV less than 0 for all available interest rates that you could possibly issue, in which case that gives you an extensive margin prediction that they don't get a loan. Okay, so everybody for whom we can solve this equation does get a loan, but otherwise they don't. Okay, so when we do this in the model, you see that the acceptance rates for the random forest, which are in red relative to the logit in blue, it looks like it's quite small, but they're slightly higher for every single group. So there is a little bit of an extensive margin effect that the new technology is able to sort of do a little bit of cream skimming and get borrowers from every group to have more loans. If you look at the spread at origination, a slightly more worrying pattern seems to emerge, which is you can see that black borrowers get higher interest rates under the random forest model than they do under the standard logit model. And Asian borrowers get lower rates under the random forest model than they do under the logit. So what this is doing is it seems to be increasing the disparity in the rates that people get under the new technology. And there's not just a first moment effect, there's also a second moment effect, which is that the standard deviation of the spread at origination within the group of borrowers also seems to increase pretty substantially. And so what this is doing is it's increasing not just between group disparity, it's also increasing within group disparity at the same time. So let me sort of wrap up here and offer a few concluding thoughts about what we're doing. I should just also say I didn't really have time to talk about this, but primarily these effects are driven by flexibility rather than triangulation. We find about 80 to 90% of the effect is coming from the fact that the new technology is simply able to better fit the cloud of points, and only about 10% is coming, or 10 to 15% is coming from the differences in the average credit rates that, the average probabilities of default that the black borrowers have relative to the white borrowers. So the sort of de-anonymization aspect is somewhat less important here. But overall, what we're finding is that these improvements in statistical technology create greater predictive power and gains for producers, because their R squared improves, their predictive power improves. But for consumers, there's an increased disparity in outcomes, primarily driven by flexibility and not by triangulation. And in particular, our analysis says that black and Hispanic borrowers in this US mortgage data are going to bear larger changes. They're more likely to be perceived as high risk. The second moment effect is that there's a greater increase in dispersion of outcomes. And the improvement seems to come from more than just putting race into the model. There's something about the nonlinearity that is quite effective at creating these changes, as we show in the paper. So we then take a leap into this counterfactual and equilibrium. We find that there are these positive extensive margin effects. They're small, but everybody seems to get more loans, but also that the unequal effects persist at the intensive margin. So let me offer a few reflections before we go into the panel. So the first question is, how should we interpret these results? There's a positive aspect to this. I've just described what's going on in the data. But there's also implicitly a normative message that is lying behind this. I think some people are initially reassured by the fact that our findings are showing you that it's mainly coming from the flexibility of the new technology, and so the new technology is better able to identify regions of default given observables than the old technology is. So, you know, it's better able to pinpoint the relationship between default income levels, FICO, and so on and so forth. And so people think, well, you know, that's fine, that's what it should do. But I think of it in a slightly different way, which is that the algorithms are actually exposing pre-existing disparities in society. So the way to think about this is that we have a tendency to tinker with the credit system to fix these problems, but the machine is basically telling you there are these problems in society, that there are income distributions that look very different. And so then it pushes it back onto you and says, okay, what are you going to do about that? Okay? Because if you give it to me, the machine, I'm going to reveal the truth. And that's essentially what's going on here. The machine is shining a light, as I began initially, which is, you know, algorithmic discrimination is just making a story, is essentially just codifying what we're actually doing in society. And I think we need to think about that a little bit more. It also leads us to ask a question, what is the equilibrium? What should it be? You know, what is sustainable? If we propose changes or diagnostics, we're going to have to do some work to identify the benefits and costs for businesses and society. What we didn't consider in this paper that makes this even more interesting, perhaps, is to think about the effect of technological competition. Suppose you have multiple providers that have different credit screening technologies, and we didn't assume Bertrand competition. How does that work? How does it work with market power? You know, how is it that the regulator needs to operate in a situation where there are these sophisticated technologies around the place? You might imagine that one solution would be to simply ban various things and say, look, you know, you can't do this and you can't do that. But then you kind of get into a race where the machine is always going to come up with a different way of circumventing the regulation. So we have to be a little bit careful. Okay, so let me stop here. I think I'm just out of time. So thanks very much for giving me the chance, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hi everyone. Oh, okay. Does it work? So welcome everyone to this panel session on artificial intelligence applications to finance. We're going to talk about risks and opportunities. So you will have the opportunity to ask questions to Tarun, but at the end of the first series of interventions. And we are going to start with Jutta Nasser, who is Senior Policy Analyst at OECD. And Jutta Nasser is going to maybe present an overview of the domains in finance to which artificial intelligence applications apply. And what are the main risks from a policy perspective and the regulatory tools that you are thinking about at OECD. And then we'll have Iris Lucas, who is head of data intelligence at IMF. So she will give us the point of view of the capital market regulator, what are the main concerns of applications, and whether there are also some opportunities for a regulator to use AI. And we'll have Christine Balague, who is professor of management at Institut Mines-Télécom Business School and founder of the research network Good in Tech, who will talk about what are the main ethics, properties, or principles that algo should abide for, and how to implement properly these algo. So that's the menu. You will have short presentations, and then we'll open questions from the audience. Thanks a lot. Jutta, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everyone, for joining this very interesting discussion. I will give a very brief overview of the policymaking perspective on artificial intelligence in finance. And this is based on a report that we have published at the OECD, which looks into the impact of the deployment of artificial intelligence on financial services and the risks that are emerging from that. The report discusses extensively challenges and risks and has some recommendations for policymakers. And to give a disclaimer, this report was actually discussed by the OECD Committee on Financial Markets at the end of 2020, early 2021, which was before the actual release of ChatGPT, which also means that we had to write the report ourselves. So not the same environment anymore. So very briefly, the parts of the financial markets that we looked into the report are asset management to begin with, and where we discussed how artificial intelligence-based models can actually be used by the buy side, both for asset allocation, stock selection, but also for optimization of operational workflows and back office and risk management. And we did discuss both the potential for alpha generation with even the most basic techniques like natural language processing, which has been around for a long, long time, but also the possible downside in terms of competition. For example, knowing that maybe for the smaller firms and the smallest funds, it's not as easy to invest in this kind of models. Then we looked into algorithmic trading. And in trading, actually the use of artificial intelligence is adding an extra layer of complexity to the conventional algorithmic trading as we know it. And of course, what is different now is that the algorithms can actually learn and dynamically evolve from the data and from the environment in which they are functioning, which makes it possible to actually identify and execute trades with minimal or even without human intervention. This is the part of the activity where we identified most of the risks from the policymaking community. Even though in liquid markets we can have great benefits for liquidity management, for execution of large orders with minimal impact for the market, optimization of size and order based on the conditions of the market, we do have important possible downside. First, when we have the use of similar models by a large number of practitioners, we can potentially prompt this kind of herding behavior that can lead to one-way markets and convergence, and this in turn may actually lead to bouts of illiquidity, particularly important in times of stress, where we can have actual flash crashes. It is also very interesting to note the potential competition-related issues, and it's more difficult for supervisors to actually identify collusion that could take place even among machines, and we have colleagues in the competition committee that have looked into this kind of collusive outcomes by the models themselves without human intervention either. The credit intermediation, which is something that Professor RAMADORAI has extensively discussed earlier on, this is where we find the most potential because of the ability of machine learning models with big data to actually extend credit to thin file clients, such as SMEs without prior credit history, or those clients that don't have score at all. And that's where we find the potential for promotion of financial inclusion and for the filling in of SME financing gaps. The downside here is also very important, and it has to do with the risks of disparate impact in credit outcomes that was discussed by Professor RAMADORAI, and the potential for discrimination, for unfair lending or biases. And I will come back to that. And the last case was about blockchain-based finance, and there we think that this kind of convergence AI blockchain is more of a hype, and what we see is either the use of AI in applications that can be helpful in DLT-based environments, or DLTs being used for data management underlying machine learning models, and not this kind of hyped conversion. What is interesting here is this risk of garbage in, garbage out, which is further amplified in case DLTs are being used for the provision for the back office of AI-based models. So I've mentioned many of those challenges, so I will not go into detail in all of them. What is important to note is that there are two types of categories of risks: those that are new and that are emerging from the novelty of AI, and those that are already existing and are just amplified through the use of artificial intelligence. Now, in terms of governance, this is something I haven't touched upon, and it's a very important one for us in the provision of financial services. It has to be said that there are existing governance-related, model governance-related provisions, both internally by financial firms and at the supervisory level. What is interesting to note is that with the novel characteristics of machine learning models, it is even more important to have very clear lines of responsibility throughout the lifetime of the deployment of such a model for financial service provision. And there is also the element of outsourced models and outsourcing to third parties, which also needs to be considered. And one example of services is the cloud services that are linked to the data and the model infrastructure. In terms of non-financial risks, data is key in this discussion at the policymaking level, both for the biases and the possible unfair treatment that I've mentioned before. And one of the things that comes to mind is also the fact that the models can actually infer some categories of data that are prohibited from being used, for example, in credit scoring. So this shows the complexity of being able to supervise or not the use of adequate models, data for those models. Of course, there are issues around data privacy and confidentiality, as with any data-based model in finance. Explainability is something that we have discussed extensively. The fact that there are different levels of explainability does not make it easy for the policy-making side to actually understand whether there are incompatibilities with the existing regulatory and supervisory frameworks, but also incompatibilities with the internal governance frameworks within those firms. By definition, any level of lack of explainability makes it difficult to supervise this kind of models. And the lack of explainability is also linked to possible systemic implications of this kind of models, because if we don't understand how a model can actually contribute to market stress, it's very difficult to actually contain this kind of effect, which can in turn lead to procyclicality and to difficult in containing the stress in times of crisis. And the last thing I would like to mention on this slide is the importance of having robust and resilient models. I will link this to the last slide, which has to do with what kind of policy responses could we consider in order to address the risks I mentioned before. So starting with the robustness and resilience, which is the last risk I mentioned, what was discussed was that policymakers need to consider either introducing or reinforcing any kind of frameworks, both for the training, retraining, and testing of AI models throughout the lifetime of their deployment, but also prior to their deployment in terms of making sure that these models will operate as intended. Validation is also very important for model drifts, and we saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic, how important it is to have actually this kind of ongoing through the lifetime of the model, and this is something that is also very different with existing model governance frameworks in finance, which are more or less one-offs. In terms of explainability, what was discussed was the need to invest and to support both academic efforts and R&D efforts to improve that, and importantly, to kind of keep the human in the loop, as we say. So using AI as a way to amplify the human capacity and not as a way to replace it. This is something that was particularly prominent in the discussions around what we call critical use cases, such as extending credit, because of the impact it can have to financial consumers. And this is where also in the European area, this is where the discussion is going in terms of regulation. Sharpening the focus on data governance is very important, as data management, adequacy and quality of data used are super important. I've talked about model governance and accountability, and there needs to be also more clarity in terms of the documentation requirements and the audit internally and for the supervisor. And last but not least, in terms of overall policy frameworks, we do have a very strong message around investing in skills. And what is interesting is that we are talking about skills of the policymaking community to be able to actually supervise this kind of activity that is increasingly emerging. But also within financial service providers, what we did realize when we were doing this work is that for the board level, senior management of those large financial institutions, it's not necessarily a given that people will understand how AI is being used and what should be in place to better safeguard against any risks. And communication will be very important. Just one example, explaining to consumers whether and how AI is being deployed in the provision of a specific service can actually help them build trust around the use. And if we don't have trust by the end users, it will never fly anyway. So I'll leave it there, but happy to discuss further any of these points. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ayota. Save your questions and you will react later, maybe just at the end of the, Iris Luca, will you, so we had some introduction by Jutta Nasser on how, regulators could use AI, or what are the specific risks that you see in the functioning of markets, and you will tell us a bit more on all that.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. So my name is Iris Luca. I'm head of a team called Data Intelligence at the IMF. It's a team of data scientists within the Data and Market Surveillance Department. The department has two main missions. The first one, or history, is to detect market abuse, to make recommendations, proposals for investigations and controls. And the second one is more recent, is to support the other business lines of the authority in their project related to data and new technologies. So through these two main missions, the question of how the AI is used as risk or as opportunities arises at different levels. I choose 2 points to address today. The first one is a question about the use of the AI by the market participant for the trading activity from the perspective of the market abuse detection. In other words, does the use of machine learning techniques for trading algorithms represent a risk for the market activity? So currently there is no position from the IMF on the subject, so what I could say does not reflect the position of the authority because there is no position. But what we know about what is doing is that most of the trading algorithms which use machine learning use supervised learning techniques, and they use it to build signals when to buy, when to sell. Because machine learning can help to take into account a large number of features based on market data, so transaction, orders, etc. But also based on alternative data, and alternative data can exist because of AI. If you want to extract information from satellite photo of commodities cargo movements, or sentiment analysis on news about specific stocks, you need the AI to do this. So I think the debate has changed more than a decade ago. The questions, we were wondering if HFT were good or bad for the markets. Tomorrow we wonder if the use of AI is good or bad for the market. And there is pros and cons, and I choose two for this session. Maybe it's a bit philosophical question, but Jutta, you address several of them. The first one, you can see the bright or the dark side. The bright side could be if machine learning can help to create algorithms about taking into account a lot of information and not only market data. So for example, the ESG factors maybe this can help to improve the price discovery, the price efficiency. There is also the dark side, the view of the other side. We could also wonder if supervised learning techniques, massively and commonly used, won't risk degrading market liquidity, because they could lead to the emergence of herding behavior that we have never seen before. Let's imagine that all the trading algorithms are trained and with the same data and learn from all the other behaviors. So they could maybe learn to build the same signals at the same time, and this fact will decrease the probability to find a match in the order book. So that's my first point about some elements to open the debate about the eventual risk or opportunity to use the AI for the trading. My second point is quite different, is the use of AI as the opportunity for the AMF to help the AMF in its mission, I mean, as any other public or private company. So, well, I used to say that we are AI consumers, we are not doing anything extraordinary. Well, in fact, maybe my team does a little bit, but so a fairly common need we have is to automatic document reading, to do some manual tasks that could take very long time for people, and there is not really added value tasks. So, for example, make automatic reading document to be able to make classification or extraction information with name entity recognition, etc., etc. So I think that today this is a need for which we use AI, NLP or not, the most. So for example, we developed such model to first reduce the time, and I think that's a very common opportunity for a very large number of companies. The second objective to use this kind of model is to expand our capabilities of detection for market abuse, but also for financial scam detection. So for example, we use NLP models to be able to detect financial scams in websites. We also use NLP to be able to extract information from regulatory reporting, and then we use this new signals, this new unstructured data to feed new algorithm for market abuse detection. So there are a few insights about what we can do with AI to help the AMF in its missions. And here, so I hope we're gonna have a question to discuss about it.
Thank you very much, Iris. And so let's finish the first part of the panel with a discussion on, okay, how should we construct this algorithm? What are the main ethics principles that we should make sure that they fulfill? With Christine Balague.
So thank you, Catherine. So my name is Christine Balague. I founded a research network called Good Intech, which is a pluridisciplinary research network between Institut Mines-Télécom, so a group of engineers, and Sciences Po in France. And we address this issue of algorithm and society, and more specifically, artificial intelligence algorithms. So just an overview of the opportunities and high risk of artificial intelligence. If you look at on the left of the side, you see a ranking of the most innovative companies in the world in 2022, and you see in the 10 first companies, mostly companies coming from the digital world, and mostly companies either American or Chinese making a lot of artificial intelligence. And some interesting figure is if you look at the MAMA, so Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Meta, and Amazon R&D expenditures in 2021, it represents $149 billion. It's more than the Pentagon, just to have the picture. So we know that on the one side, there are a lot of great opportunities, but on the other side, we have a lot of risk. And there's a very good paper from Verts in 2022 categorizing the risk into 6 types of risks. The first one, and I will come back to this risk, it's technological data and analytical artificial intelligence risk, data bias, violation of privacy, vulnerability of data. The second one is informational and communication artificial intelligence risk. So online disinformation, manipulation, fake news. The third one is economic risk. Of course, we know this risk about disruption of labor market, for instance. Then we have social risk, discrimination, ethical risk, if we harm people, and the last one is legal and regulatory artificial intelligence risk. What do we do to compensate the victim? It's a clear question today. So if we look at the financial market, all these risks apply to financial services and market. So I worked a lot in different committees on artificial intelligence in France, and we work a lot on this topic. And if I summarize the big ethical challenges of artificial intelligence today, there are main 5 ethical challenges. The first one is a traditional statistical risk, data bias, so garbage in, garbage out, selection bias. But the most important one is endogeneity bias, which is specific to artificial intelligence because you predict the future based to past behaviors. That means that, of course, if you have no past behaviors, you cannot predict the future, so you cannot predict a lot of events such as COVID, such as Ukraine war or something like that. The second one comes from sociology background, so I'm not going to focus on that, but just to mention this risk, is digital labor and micro work. In the previous presentation, it was mentioned supervised model. In supervised model, you need to code a database at the beginning of a process. And it's called in sociology digital labor. Most of the case, it's done by people in countries with very low salaries. So that's a sort of exploitation of some people in the world by rich people and capturing all the values from artificial intelligence. So that is an ethical also challenge. The third one, it was discussed before, it's the discrimination effect. So we have a lot of literature about gender discrimination in a lot of sectors, and so in finance and financial services, race, minorities. For instance, you have some papers now on LGBT, for instance, discrimination effect through algorithms. I will come back to this effect. You have also, of course, the opacity of the systems. We know today how artificial intelligence systems are performant, but even data scientists or computer scientists doesn't know what are the variables explains this performance. So there is a problem because we don't know what are the potential manipulation behind this problem of opacity. And then the last one, very well known in a certain sector, it's filtering bubbles, for instance, existing in recommender systems very regularly. It's the fact that you always send to one individual the same recommendation based on his past behavior. So that means that you create a bubble, and this bubble impacts a very big principle, which is the autonomy of individuals, and I will come back to that. So what is interesting is to look at the different solutions we have to solve these ethical challenges of artificial intelligence today. So if I come back to pluridisciplinary research made on this stuff, we had a very rich pluridisciplinary research on trustworthy artificial intelligence. So this first area, and it began in 2014, is based on the fact that we must respect big principles. What are these big principles? It comes from biomedical area. It is justice, autonomy principle, beneficence. So we must prove that there's an added value of a technology on the market, and non-beneficence. That means that we must guarantee that we don't have negative effect. So these principles were at the basis of the ethics guideline on trustworthy artificial intelligence made by the European Commission and by 52 experts of the European Commission, and the report begins by these principles. So this report proposed 7 requirements to have a trustworthy artificial intelligence, such as, and we discussed a little bit before, accountability, for instance, of course, data governance, transparency of system, non-discrimination, human guarantee, etc., etc. This first area of solution were criticized because it was too high-level principles. So when you have a data scientist teams, how do you do to implement accountability? How do you do to implement transparency of algorithms? So more recently, you have the of course, the computer science area saying we are going to solve the problem by techniques, because computer science introduces in the algorithm technical solution to be ethical. So it's a sort of ethics by design. So I'm going to speak about 2 areas here, fairness of algorithms and interpretability. So fairness, you put a constraint in the algorithm, for instance, disparate impact, or you impose to the algorithm to have the same rate of false positive or false negative between the 2 categories you don't want to discriminate. This fairness, it was, we had a very impressive presentation in the beginning, but this fairness has been also, the solution, technical solution, has been also criticized, because when you use traditional categories, you're going to focus on 1 category or 2 categories. So you're going to impose on the, to the algorithms to this fairness on these categories, but you can create intra-category discrimination, and you have also all the literature saying that you have adverse effects, and sometimes fairness is non-efficient at all. The other technical solution is explainability. It was mentioned before. We don't like explainability in our research. We prefer interpretability. And you see that we forget totally transparency, which doesn't mean anything when you are in an economic sector, because of course companies are not going to be transparent in their algorithm. So what does it mean, interpretability? It means that you explain the algorithm, but you explain to someone who understands the algorithm. So if you have customers, they have to understand what you say. So this is interpretability. And if you're a manager in a bank, you must understand how the algorithm works. So we worked with the doctoral students on this interpretability, and we showed on credit scoring, for instance, that there are different types of explainability of algorithm. We use the counterfactual explanation on credit scoring or post-hoc Shapley explanation. And what is interesting in the results is the fact that according to the explainability or interpretability you use, the results on customers is different. People perceive the interest of understanding the models, and it reduces the negative comment, and it increases the trust perception in the service. So this doctoral student has created a company called Giscard, implemented all his stuff on ethics of technology. The third, of course, solution, it's nowadays the solution investigated by a lot of companies, because in 2024, we will have, 2025, we will have a regulation, which is the European Artificial Intelligence Act. And here it's not based on principles, it's not based on technical solution, it's based on risk management. So the other issue is to say, is my application, or does my application has a big risk on society, and I need to prove if I have a systemic risk, a high systemic risk, or no. So all the application will be ranked according to the risk, and you will have, of course, prohibited application of artificial intelligence, like mentioned here, credit scoring, high risk, And what's it's interesting in finance papers is the fact that nowadays you have, for instance, 23 papers on credit scoring, saying that has credit scoring a high risk or not? So this paper concludes by the fact that it's not a high risk, so we don't need to have requirements on this sort of credit. So probably we will have other papers like that. So you see here that for high risk application, there will be a lot of requirements on database, so to verify and to have verification of the quality of the database. You will have to document, of course, the technical documentation to have accountability of the system. You need to provide information to the user, and we will have the human oversight. So what's interesting here is that the regulator say we won't give the decision 100% to the machine. We, for high-risk application, we will have a human guarantee and human oversight, and of course, robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. So you have a lot of labels existing today which is the first step to this regulation. And the last one, I will conclude with that. It's a paper we have published in 2022 in Journal of Business Ethics, because it's not enough, all this stuff, because it's limited at each step. So we propose to have real reflexivity on what we do when we do artificial intelligence, and we have to have a critical perspective. And I will come back to the fairness issue just quickly. In this paper, we say, for instance, in credit scoring, there's a course to have plenty of data. So we have now in artificial intelligence a very important granularity of data, because more you have data and more the probability the performance of a model is high. So you have the observed space on the left. So this observed space, for instance, for credit scoring, you have papers showing that you're going to look at transactional data, social media use, a lot of data very different from just financial data, and it improves the performance of a model. The problem of this granularity of the data is the hypothesis space you create by the machine learning technique. So in this hypothesis space, the problem is that you create artificial categories, and not only categories such as gender, such as minorities, such as LGBT, and etc. You create artificial categories, and these artificial categories create new forms of discrimination effects. So we need to also address this issue of categories, artificial categories, creating discrimination, and to discuss it in committees. So that is what we propose in this paper. And just to end, I just show with you this wonderful paper, because nowadays you see also new papers published on impact of artificial intelligence on SDG and how we can measure that. And this paper says that in nearly 80% of the case, there are positive impact of artificial intelligence on SDG, but we need to work on the negative impact side, the dark side, because it represents 35% of the case. And I think it's an interesting also manner to evaluate risk of AI is to measure impact on sustainable goals, sustainable development goals. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a first question.
So, Tarun, your characterization of machine learning tells me something like this, that it is improved information, both because of the larger information set it builds upon, and because of the more flexible technology that nests the traditional one. So it came to my mind what is the Hirschleifer effect that is telling what improved information does on financial markets, which is an improvement in efficiency, which is like your better screening, but it destroys insurance opportunities. And so that's inequitable. So I think, I wonder whether it is like a special case of the Hirschleifer effect, or it has other dimensions. Thank you.
That's a great question. So there's a way of looking at this if you think about flexibility in particular, which is this ability to fit a better function with the new technology relative to the old technology. That the old technology is pooling everybody at the same credit score. So an easier way to think about this is think about a world in which you can only fit the mean. So you get everybody exactly the same predicted probability of default. And you move to a world where you have a linear model that you can add into that place. Now, immediately you're going to get more dispersion in the credit scores in that world. So it's true that you get more pooling when you have the more primitive technology, but it's a very odd form of pooling where lenders basically don't have the ability to discriminate. And by that, I don't just mean discriminate across different groups, but discriminate across different borrowers in any way. So, and I think we think about credit markets slightly differently from the way we think about insurance markets, because there is some way of thinking about what your risks are from the perspective of the producer. So we have to be a little bit careful, because what can happen if we sort of continue down that road of thinking, oh, we're getting more insurance with older technology, is that we build lots of regulatory constraints into the process that give people very similar outcomes. And so this is where it's better in some ways in a credit market to go back to the venerable welfare theorems, go for the efficient outcome, and then redistribute the way you want. That would be a preferable solution than having bad technology pool and give everybody equal outcomes.
Yes, I can go on with a related question. So maybe to relate what you say with Christine's concern about intra-group discrimination, right? I think that's something we see, right? Because you do not really discuss fairness, because you compare the machine learning solution to the traditional one and you see who gains, who loses. But then I'd like to ask you about the fairness question now. I think we see that some groups, they lose compared to others in one given category. So what would be your advice in terms, if we wanted to impose some fairness criteria in that context, what would you do then?
So I think there's some questions here. So whenever you have a more sophisticated technology coming in, we prove a theorem in the paper that says you're going to have winners and losers relative to the old technology if they simply are able to fit the relationship a lot better. You're just going to get a bigger spread. It's a more informative technology, and therefore information creates more dispersion. That dispersion means that you're going to have winners generically and losers in that economy. Now, it's not necessarily unfair in the sense that people are being essentially given credit scores that are, or probabilities of default that are more accurate mappings to observable characteristics.
But in your example, the middle group, for example,
Yep.
Of the, let's call them the black, they were
Yep.
estimated because the bulk of the white distribution was lower. They were misestimated in a way because they were estimating on the distribution of the largest group. So in a way you could say it's unfair because compared to the other groups, the extremes one on the black line, they are treated differently from the two groups at the extreme.
Yeah, I mean, you could ask a question. Do you want to estimate the model separately, group by group?
Yes.
And then do you want to do redistribution that way? I mean, that's one way to think about it. The question is, what's the benchmark? But, you know, a different way to think about it is estimate the model as efficiently as you can with all of the information you have. And if you want to do some redistribution, don't do it by messing with the credit allocation system because it creates distortions.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question for you. Have you thought about exploring taking the race out and finding variables that may come to the same conclusion of different races?
So I should be very clear. In everything that we did, race wasn't in the model. Okay? So this is kind of like the triangulation or flexibility example, which is that the machine basically, 15% of the time, or 15% of the effect is the machine figures out what your race is based on where you're located in the space of characteristics. But 85% of the time, the machine is just more accurately pinpointing what is the structural relationship, if you want to use the word structural, between the characteristics that you have and default outcomes. And so what we did was, in order to come up with that decomposition 85-15, we put race in and took it out of the model. But all of the stuff that you saw is with race not in the model. You just get the disparity effects because of flexibility. Putting race in the model tells you why these effects are happening, but all of the results are without race in the model, which is kind of interesting.
Hi, I have a question about some of your results. If I remember correctly, you were finding, especially for blacks, that, everybody gets more loans, all the groups get more loans, but for the blacks, the rates increased, right? Could it be the case that with this new technology, you can actually offer some risky people that would have otherwise been denied credit higher rates, and maybe that increases the average in the group? And do you know, is this necessarily bad, is my question.
Yeah, so you're right that basically the model is doing some cream skimming, right? It's basically going in there and saying, you're not all monolithic. I see a spread here. I'm going to take some of you. Maybe I offer you higher rates rather than simply shutting you out of credit market equilibrium. That's absolutely the case. So in that sense, it is increasing within group disparity. It's also increasing across group disparity as it happens, because the spread in the rates offered to different ethnic groups on average is also different. Look, it's a trade-off, right? It sort of depends on let me put it this way. The paper, because it's an academic paper, describes what's going to happen. Okay? It tells you that if you believe our setup and if you think of, what we've done is rigorous, this is what's going to happen. Now, you might say, I'm happy with that. But that would be your decision. And essentially, the public conversation begins where our paper stops. And so you then decide what your objective function is. What are you maximizing? You want to give more credit to people? Sure. Here's what's going to happen in terms of disparity. I think we're starting to learn that disparity is a pretty scary thing. If you look around the world right now, it's driving some pretty uncomfortable outcomes. And so if you have some loss function in society that emphasizes that, then our analysis says maybe you need to pay attention to that. But perhaps the other panelists would have a view on that as well, given their work.
Sorry, but can you discriminate about the guys that wouldn't have gotten credit before and how much they're paying? How much of the effect comes from?
We do that in the paper. So we have a very clear decomposition about what the average rate is for the people who are in and out. If it's not in the paper, then it's in the Internet appendix, which is, in addition to having additional details, also a super cure for insomnia.
So it's perhaps a bit philosophical, and a bit provocative. Isn't the fact that you are assigning those tags of ethnicity also a way for us to continue perpetuating the biases that we have in the way we see the world, which is then very difficult to blame the model for data that have already inherent biases in them?
Look, I think that's a little bit outside of the scope of the paper, but I'll take that on. I think there's a question here about, I think people have this implicit concern about where does it end, okay? So you might imagine that there's a conversation about reparations, okay? And then people say, well, how far back do we want to go? Okay? We're not here to talk about that, okay? You might say, well, let's just abolish all of the labels. We start today. We've got the information we've got. This is what the income distributions look like. Off we go. I think different people are going to have different views on whether that's a reasonable thing to do. You know, for example, there's all kinds of conversations about at what point. Let me put it differently. If I were to tell you, which is true, that controlling for occupation, female wages were lower than male wages, I think we'd want to know that. By just saying, oh, no, we're assessing productivity and, you know, well, I think having the information is a good thing.
So just to because we are almost out of time, but to wrap up on that, so what you're saying is that it's good to have, you know, these new techniques because we have more precise information. Now, Christine was saying that, you know, it can be bad for society that we are creating these subcategories that we. So, Christine, what would you respond to that? You know, that is it good to have this more precise information on?
Yes, the problem we showed in our paper is the fact that it's really a course to have more and more and more data, and except the problem of surveillance, which is very important also here, ethical challenge also of somewhere artificial intelligence. You have this learning process creating artificial categories. So we always speak about, because we are we traditionally use these categories such as race, such as minorities, such as gender or over, but we must also discuss the new categories created by these algorithms, and it's a new area of research because few things have been done on that, and this is dangerous because we don't control probably a lot of discrimination effect of this model for the moment. So we need to investigate that.
So unless there is one last question, let me just scan the audience. I think we are super late. Yes. Okay, so you will have a shorter break. So I want to thank everyone for this panel discussion. And is it the time for the break now? Thanks a lot.